All right. Hello, Tom. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning into the Protect OT series, where we talk about industrial cybersecurity and protecting critical infrastructure. My name is Ray LaPena. I'm the VP of Marketing at Industrial Defender. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Tom Alrich, who's going to help us shed some light on what's going on with NERC CIP and the cloud. So, hey, Tom, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ray.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
our pleasure. So
Good.
Tom, you've been working in OT cybersecurity since before OT security was even like an industry term. Before we get
Since the
into,
Civil War, I think, was when it started.
I'm
But,
sure. Before we get into the cloud stuff, would you mind just taking a minute, just kind of introducing yourself, how you got into the space, what your areas of focus have been?
well, I've been working on SIP since like 2008. And so, but the cloud has always been, until a few years ago, it was just kind of, people knew it was out there, but they knew that they weren't very interested in it. The NERC entities weren't very interested. FERC was adamantly opposed to it. NERC was adamantly opposed to it. So it was just kind of a non-issue. But in the last, well, more than 3 years, maybe 4 or 5 years, but it's really accelerating now. It's getting to be a real problem. And
Well, I know there was a lot of hesitation, but it's like new technology is inevitable. So,
yeah,
what really is the problem? What is the exact problem with um, NERC CIP and the cloud? What's the challenge?
okay. Well, the problem is that the medium and high impact best cyber systems, which I'll call BCS, and then electronic access controller monitoring systems, EACMS, and physical access control systems, PACS, are effectively not allowed to be implemented in the cloud today. As medium and high impact lows can pretty much do whatever they want, but mediums and highs are not allowed to be implemented in the cloud, those three types of systems. And if a NERC entity which owns or operates a medium or high impact environment utilizes a service in the cloud that functions as one of those types of systems, they will also probably be in violation. So, just as if they had implemented those services in the cloud themselves. So, that's the
Why
problem. Go
and
ahead.
why is that? So, do the CIP requirements say that or prohibit the use of cloud-based medium or high impact systems?
Well, most people assume that's the case. That is, they assume that the wording of the standard somehow prohibits use of the cloud for these systems. However, the current SIP standards say nothing at all about the cloud. And that's because the current SIP framework with, the BES cyber systems classified as high, medium, and low impact, etc., was first formulated in 2009. And at that time, use of the cloud was still considered highly experimental by FERC and NERC and most NERC entities. So no one really considered the idea that there would ever be a time when even FERC would agree that it's safe to use the cloud, and yet that's the case now. Uh, so the problem then is not that the SIP standards don't allow these things in the cloud, but they don't say anything at all about the cloud. However, so a NERC entity that wants to implement a medium or high impact best cyber system in the cloud is free to do so. However, in doing that, they will still be violating maybe 10 to 20 SIP requirements. Now, you may ask, well, then they really are. The requirements are really prohibiting use of the cloud. The requirements are not. But the problem is that the cloud service provider will never be able to provide the NERC entity with the documentary evidence that's required to prove compliance. And as anyone involved with NERC compliance and not just with SIP compliance, any NERC standard knows, if you don't document it, you didn't do it. And that's the problem. It's the documentation. It's not the compliance itself. It's the problem.
That's interesting. So, why can't the cloud service provider provide that compliance evidence?
Well, this gets back to a fundamental problem with SIP that's seldom acknowledged, which is that there are a lot of implicit requirements that don't appear in the SIP standards. That is, they're de facto requirements, um, but they're not in the standards, and so the NERC entity can't be fined or cited for any of them for non-compliance with an implicit requirement that isn't written down. However, um, if the NERC entity doesn't perform one of those implicit requirements, they'll be in violation of one or more of the explicit requirements, and i.e. the ones that are written down. So here's a simple example. There are a lot of SIP requirements that apply to EACMS, which is Electronic Access Control or Monitoring Systems, and then PCAs, which are Protected Cyber Assets, and PACS, Physical Access Control Systems, yet there is no requirement to identify such systems in the first place. In theory, as there is for BES cyber systems, SIP-02 R1 requires identification of BES cyber systems, but there's no requirement for EACMS, for identifying EACMS, PCAs, or PACS. And in theory, a NERC entity could tell their auditor that their audit scope for, say, SIP 7R2, which is patch management, doesn't apply to EACMS because they've never identified any EACMS because there's no requirement to do so. So they could make that case, and they might very well be completely right. On the other hand, they know they're going to get slammed by the auditors if they do it, so they're not going to do it. So, but that's the thing. There are lots of these implicit requirements. Now, to get to our point here with the cloud, one implicit requirement has to do with the fact that BES cyber systems are composed of BES cyber assets, or which I'll call BCAs, and those are actual devices. I mean, BES cyber system is a nebulous concept that just means a combination of BES cyber assets, and pretty much the utility can do whatever they want. Can combine one or 1,000. In fact, I know one entity that at one point had 3,000 relays in one, spread across several Midwestern states as one BES cyber system, and they can do that. But BCAs are individual devices, so they're always just one device and something you can point to. A BCS you can't point to. So for a lot of requirements that apply to BCS, like the requirements for cybersecurity policies or cybersecurity training, it's fine that BES cyber assets aren't mentioned since they play no role in policies or training anyway. But for requirements like SIP 7R2 patch management, SIP 10R1 configuration management, or configuration change management, I guess it's called, individual devices must be taken into account. There's no way to comply with the requirement otherwise. Now, for example, you don't patch a system, meaning a combination of cyber assets. You patch each cyber asset individually, and although you may have automation, so you don't have to patch each one literally, but it has to be patched individually. You can't just patch the whole system. If you have a BES cyber system that consists of, say, 100 BES cyber assets, and you don't follow the SIP 7R2 procedures for just one of those BCAs for 1 month, you'll be in violation for the whole BCS, just as if you hadn't patched the other 99 BCAs either. So that's the thing. The requirement applies to a BCS, but it in fact applies to the BCAs individually, and you have to apply the requirement like SIP 7R2 to each individual BCA. And if you just miss one of them, you've missed the whole BCS. You haven't just missed the one BCA, and that's it's because this is all an implicit requirement which isn't even written down. So even though the requirement may apply to BCS, there's an implicit requirement that says each individual BCA is in scope. Now, let's go back to the question of evidence for BES cyber systems in the cloud. Let's assume a NERC entity has implemented a single BCS in the cloud. And for many of that is with the rules in place today, And for many of the CIP requirements, like CIP 3R1, the requirement for cybersecurity policies, the fact that the BCS is made up of individual devices doesn't matter, since that fact is irrelevant to compliance. It's just the system that matters. So the system could be just as easily put in the cloud or on premises, or it doesn't matter. However, for CIP 7R2 and some other CIP requirements like CIP 10R1 or CIP 5R1, it definitely does matter that the individual best cyber assets are in scope. So, and the problem is there's no way a cloud service provider could provide the evidence required to comply with CIP 7R2. And that's because the system in the cloud is always split up among lots of different servers, different devices. They might be in different data centers all over, and they may move from one server to another, one data center to another, from minute to minute. And now let's suppose a NERC entity decides to implement a single medium impact best cyber system in the cloud, not thinking clearly. The NERC entity asks the CSP to be sure to follow the requirements of CIP 7R2. And now the CSP is almost sure to think, well, we have our FedRAMP certification, or, well, it's really authorization, or ISO 27001 certification, and that's all the evidence we need. There's no, because when you look at the CIP 7R2 requirement for patch management, what's in FedRAMP is probably much more stringent. So surely that will be sufficient for the auditors, because they'll say, oh yeah, well these guys are doing much more than what's required. Well, unfortunately, that's wrong, because so they'll just provide the normal FedRAMP evidence packet that CSPs normally provide to their cloud customers when they ask for it. However, if the entity presents the CSP's evidence to the auditor, they'll likely receive at least one notice of potential violation. I'm sorry. And perhaps many. The auditor will say, it's nice, but that doesn't fulfill CIP 7R 2.2. And I'm assuming here, right now I'm just going to talk about one part of CIP 2, and that's CIP 7R 2.2. They'll continue, please provide me evidence that you fulfilled the exact language of part 2.2, which reads, at least once every 35 calendar days, evaluate security patches for applicability that have been released since the last evaluation from the source or sources identified in part 2.1. Moreover, and that's the requirement, but the requirement part, but the auditor will also say, I need this for every physical device on which any part of this best cyber system has resided during the 3-year audit period, even for just a few seconds. Because that's the thing. You will have to, literally, to take the requirement seriously, you have to have evidence for every device that any part of the best cyber system, and of course in the cloud, a single system will often be broken up among tens or hundreds of different devices. It's never kept together, because that kind of would break the whole cloud model to try to keep a system together. I mean, the whole idea is to parcel it out where it makes most sense. And so the number of physical devices in scope, and so for each of those devices, even if it had just resided a second on one device, you have to have evidence that it was in compliance for the entire 3-year audit period. That is, every 35 days they check every piece of software that's on there. And of course, most of the software is probably not owned by the entity, NERC entity. It's owned by other customers of the CSP. So, it's just literally impossible. It would be huge. I mean, you might very well have tens of thousands of pieces of evidence required just for this one, like screenshots, just for part 2.2 of requirement R2 of CIP 007, and then you have to go do something like that for a lot of the other requirements as well. So, that's the thing. It would just be a huge job, and no CSP is going to do that, period. So that's why it's needless to say, it's just an astronomical amount of work. Um, just for one best cipher system, one part of one requirement, it's an astronomical amount of work. So, it's just clear no CSP would ever promise to do this if they knew this is what they're required to do. So it's, from what I've heard that, no NERC auditor can tell you, can tell me that there's you know, they know of a case where an entity has implemented a medium or high impact best cyber system in the cloud, period. And if they did, they would literally be in violation of, they would probably be, they could have tens of thousands of violations for 1 3 year audit period. So, I mean, that's the problem. It's just impossible.
Oh,
And
gee. I mean, I can see how that's a problem and a big headache, and more than a headache with those violations.
yeah, more
So,
than a
I mean,
headache.
what needs to be done to solve the problem here, to solve the problem with the SIP requirements, if these utilities do want to start using the cloud in a meaningful way?
Yeah. Well, the standards need to be changed. Now, you know, we'll see if there's some sort of intermediate step that might be allowed, but it's hard to see how that would happen. There is an emergency procedure in the NERC rules of procedure that, you know, might allow something different to happen. But let's discuss first what what needs to be done. Um, Actually, the SIP modification standards drafting team, which is the one working on virtualization, um, and they've been around since like 2016, I think. Um, and they in 2018 they pointed out, well, they actually started to draft changes to the SIP requirements, not for virtualization, I mean, not for the cloud purpose, but for virtualization, but they would have worked equally well for the cloud that would have actually solved the problem. They proposed that Bez Cyber System be made the fundamental unit of SIP compliance, and that the terms cyber asset and Bez Cyber Asset be retired. Currently, Bez Cyber Asset is the fundamental unit of SIP compliance, and Bez Cyber Asset is defined at, it's has 15-minute impact, etc. Um, so meanwhile, a Bez Cyber System is just a combination of Bez Cyber assets. That's all it says. It doesn't say anything about, how you combine it or for what purpose. It just says Bez Cyber Assets. Well, it does say for reliability purposes, I think. No, for compliance purposes, which is meaningless because sure, that's why you're doing it. But instead, um, but if you did what they said, what the drafting team was suggesting, the system would then have a 15-minute impact, not the best cyber asset. As I said, the individual assets would disappear from SIP, um, which would, so what that would mean is that the cloud service provider would no longer have to track all the stuff that we are just talking about, where all the different devices where a Bez cyber system or even just a part of a system had resided over 3 years, they wouldn't have to do that anymore. They could just talk in terms of the system, which itself is, a concept. They would have to demonstrate. Well, that's the point. The standards have to be rewritten, but it would certainly be possible for the cloud provider then to provide evidence. But the drafting team also realized in 2018 that in order to make BCS the fundamental unit of compliance, all the SIP requirements would need to be risk-based. You couldn't leave them as prescriptive anymore. And some of them were already risk-based. Like SIP 7R3, malware production, is risk-based. SIP 10R4, transient cyber assets, is risk-based. Now, they don't use the word risk, but they effectively are. They call them objectives-based, but that there's no way you can do objectives-based unless it's risk-based. So it's the same thing in my opinion. And then SIP 11R1, information protection, that's risk-based. So, and there are others too. And now there are more. But requirements like SIP 7R2, patch management, SIP 10R1 configuration change management are highly prescriptive, and that's the opposite of risk-based. So all the drafting team started out said, well, we're going to have to rewrite all the prescriptive requirements as risk-based. And I was quite happy with that because I had decided that year really that that there was no sense in anymore having prescriptive requirements. They all need to be risk-based, and then then SIP would be a much more rational set. I mean, right now, and I still believe the big problem with SIP is it imposes huge costs for, yeah, it certainly does secure the grid more than it would be otherwise. In fact, a lot more. But given the costs that entities have to, lay out to comply, which, like, as I said, documenting every instance of, where the system has been, et cetera, that's just, the costs are too high. And so, but risk-based would definitely change that situation. So I was happy about that. But when the drafting team announced they would need to make these changes, they expected to be greeted like conquering heroes, since people realized that that's why compliance was so expensive. It was because of these prescriptive requirements like SIP 7R2. However, the bigger utilities realized that even though the prescriptive requirements were very expensive to comply with and required lots of meaningless work that had nothing to do with security, they'd already made a huge investment in training, documentation, software, etc., for the existing requirements, and they didn't want to throw all that away, which they would have had to do to start complying with the new risk-based requirements. So they dug in their heels, and that was it. That was the end of the drafting team's idea for the time being. And they went back to what they're still working on now, which is making other changes to accommodate virtualization. And in any case, that's what they're doing. But the original, those ideas from 2018 were revived last year and included in a new standards authorization request, SAR, designed to finally fix the cloud problem. And that SAR was approved by the NERC Standards Committee in December. So now this SAR also makes Bez Cyber System the fundamental unit of SIP compliance, but it does it just for cloud-based systems, not for all. And that was probably the mistake of the drafting team in 2018. They made the fundamental change for all systems, and that meant entities that were happy with the systems they already had. I mean, the compliance procedures they had, etc. We're gonna have to throw them all away. They didn't want to do that. Well, now they don't have to. There will be two tracks for cloud-based systems. The entity will have to, there'll be risk-based requirements. I mean, obviously they haven't been written yet. That in fact the drafting team won't even be constituted till the summer. So, we can't say what will be in there, but it's almost inevitable there'll be risk-based requirements, and, there'll be some consideration of the FedRAMP authorization or ISO 27001 certification or something, assuming the CSP has it. And, but put any systems in the cloud, nothing at all has to change for them. And even for one that does put them in the cloud, their on-premises systems will be still covered by the same STIP requirements that are in effect now. So that's a nice thing. Nobody has to throw anything away, and if they don't want to. If they don't care about the cloud, they don't have to change anything at all. And that hopefully will be what allows this to happen. Now, again, just because it's in the SAR does not mean it will actually be in the final requirements. So who knows what will actually happen? But in any case, that's the way they're going now. And I mean, that's the way the SAR reads, and what the drafting team does, though, will be up to them. But it should be obvious that they're not gonna, try to make everybody do a change because they know it's they're going to meet the same fate as the 2018 team did. So when is it likely that the changes to SIP that will allow all these SIP, these three types of systems to be implemented in the cloud will happen? Uh, when will that happen? Well, that's a sad story because the SAR just, it allows the drafting team to be assembled, and the rest is up to the drafting team. The team won't even be constituted till the summer because the standards committee decided this is just a medium importance item, and so meaning it's needed to start late. Now, they said medium importance because they've got like 23 other standards projects going on, obviously not just for SIP, for all the NERC requirements, so NERC standards. So, there's a lot going on, and so they couldn't just jump the queue for all these other things that had been waiting longer than this has. So, but the thing is, these changes will be more thoroughgoing than any previous SIP changes, including SIP version 5, which was the biggest change since version 1, for instance, they were implemented. And they'll probably involve changes to the NERC rules of procedure because, with so much, with risk-based standards, you really do need to look at the auditing procedures. The auditing procedures are not well suited for risk-based, and that's going to have to change. And that, who knows? The SIP standards have never involved a change to the rules of procedure, as far as I know. So that'll be more. It'll take more time, a few more years, I'm sure. So, in other words, it could take 6 years, in my opinion, at least, before the new standards are approved by NERC and FERC and ready to be implemented. That is, whatever implementation period has expired now, when they're ready to be implemented. So, that's the problem. And as I just mentioned, more and more software providers, security service providers, etc., are moving to the cloud, and they're telling their customers, you know what? You've got to follow us to the cloud. If not, I'm sorry, we're going to have to drop you.
Mm.
So that's more and more. And, one person well, not one person, but there's a whole group called the CTAG, Cloud Technical Advisory Group, that I'm part of. It's completely a, unofficial NERC group, but it's led by one very well-known figure in one of the regional entities, and his opinion is that in 2 to 3 years there's going to be an emergency. If nothing is done, there will be an emergency where clearly the security and/or reliability of the grid are at risk unless something is done. And that's why I mentioned this break glass procedure, which might have to be implemented, but if it has to be implemented, it should be implemented sooner or later. What you don't want to do is get to, year 2.5 and say, oh my God, in the next 6 months, we've got to do something drastic. And then you take drastic steps, Right now, there's still a chance to take maybe incremental steps. In fact, I put up a post just last weekend, I guess, suggesting one way to do it using SIP 13. Kind of a Hail Mary idea. But, the thing is, there's definitely time to deal with it now if we start now. But if we wait 2 years or 2.5 years, and then realize it's a huge problem and we had to do something right away, who knows what's going to happen? And so that's the problem.
So there's some progress on cloud, but slow progress, not fast enough for you. Gotcha. So a lot more to come, huh?
Yeah, there's a lot more to come.
And
Hopefully
speaking of, I know you'll be following this. How can people find you if they want to follow along on your observations and analysis of movement on the NERC CIP and cloud front?
Well, I can read my blog. It's It's called. Do you have a pencil? Are you ready to write down? It's called Tom Alrich's blog, and it was a brilliant title.
Is
I
memorable.
Yeah, I paid Ernst and Young a ton of money to come up with that title, so it was worth every penny. I'll tell you. But um, in any case, no. So that you can do that. I've been doing that since 2013. I have now well over 1,000 posts on there. Probably about half of them have to do with NERC CIP. Um, so, but no, I mean, there will be a lot of publicity about this. And, and the thing about the drafting process is that everybody can get involved. I mean, if you want to be on the drafting team, you can volunteer and, they choose people to be on the drafting team, but you've got to be able to make a substantial time commitment, or your employer does, because obviously hopefully they won't make you do well, sometimes they do, and they don't really reduce the scope of the person's job either, and they say, oh, okay, by the way, you got to be on this drafting team. But it's really interesting I've attended a lot of meetings. I was never on a team because I can't be on a team, but they're the meetings are really interesting, and especially when you're talking about really meaty subjects like the cloud. So it's very interesting. But if you can't do that, you can certainly follow along with that. And anybody can attend any of the meetings whenever you want. You don't have to be on the drafting team at all. You can, they have a plus list. They have a mailing list of just people who are interested, that are not on the team, or they're not part of NERC or something where they have an official duty there. They're just interested. And, you can get on that list, and they'll have a lot of meetings out. My guess is they'll be a lot more virtual than they were when Subversion 5 was being drafted, because they were almost all, well, they're in-person meetings, but they had some phone meetings as well. But now I would think they'll be more virtual than on site. But there will be kind of summaries and things posted, I'm sure, like that. And if your region will always, try to get people up to speed on what's going on. So there'll be a lot of information out there. But my
Gotcha.
blog will be one source.
Yeah. All right. Well, Tom Alrich's blog, we'll make sure to drop that link in the description. And I'd say if anyone else has, questions on what we talked about today, or some thoughts or comments of your own, please feel free to drop those into the comments below. Tom, I want to thank you again. Lots of great information. Hopefully we'll continue to see some progress on NERC CIP and the cloud, and we'll all work towards a more secure and reliable energy system here. So
Yeah.
thanks everyone. And Tom, we will catch you again sometime. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Red.